Welcome to a lecture on Middle Platonism, Justin Martyr, and Logos theology. This lecture will situate Justin Martyr within his Middle Platonic intellectual milieu, and will trace out what Logos theology means, what Justin inherited from Middle Platonism, in particular figures such as Philo of Alexandria, and how Justin deviated from normal thinking about Logos. We'll gesture forward toward the ways that Justin's Logos theology was problematic for later Trinitarian thinking. We start with Justin. Just briefly, in terms of Justin's life, Justin introduces himself as a Platonic philosopher from Samaria. He converted, he says, first after he converted to Platonism, after having tried out all the philosophical schools. This is something of a standard trope in antiquity, the claim that you checked out everything and stuck with what was best. But then Justin does one better than the usual Hellenistic idea that I tried the academics and the Stoics and the Epicureans and then stuck with whichever it is. Justin says, I decided ultimately I was unsatisfied with Platonism when compared with this new philosophy, Christianity. What struck him especially about the Christians, he says, is the fearlessness with which they embraced death on behalf of fidelity to their God and their beliefs. One of Justin's major works, which we won't look at in this unit, is his dialogue with Trypho the Jew. He describes an encounter, probably fictitious, but that doesn't particularly matter, with Trypho shortly after the war with Rome of the Bar Kokhba revolt. And they have a fascinating and lengthy discussion about why it is that Gentile believers in Christ, like Justin, are not followers of the Mosaic law. I encourage you, if you ever have the occasion, to pick up the dialogue with Trypho. It's a rich source of theology and a glimpse of early Christian growing pains as they try to sort out what it means to claim that they read and believe the books of Moses while admitting that they don't do the things described and commanded in the books of Moses. Finally, Justin is known as Justin Martyr because he was arrested, put on trial, and executed in Rome for his faith in Christianity sometime in the middle of the 160s. Now, Justin identifies himself as a Platonist philosopher, and we want to situate what Platonism means at this period. We will give a sort of breakneck survey of the history of the successors to Plato, but we will focus especially on the developments of what is called Middle Platonism. If Whitehead famously declared that all of European philosophy is merely a series of footnotes to Plato, this was certainly true in the ancient world. But there were already some sharp distinctions between what it meant to follow Plato. Plato's first successors would include people like his pupil Aristotle, who aren't even part of the academy in this schema, you will notice. That is, some followers were so divergent from Plato that they started their own schools. Aristotle starts the Peripatetics. But among his successors, his first successors continue to be interested in ethics and in numbers, and his theory that numbers might lie at the basis of all reality. This is something Plato inherits from Pythagoras. This is followed by a lengthy and very influential period of the academy, which you may not know about, and it's important to say a bit more about this, and that is that the academy turned skeptical. The term the New Academy is already an ancient designation. So the ancients recognized this is something different, this is something new, but the skeptical academy insisted that what it meant to be a proper philosopher was not to insist upon the reality of the forms or post-mortem judgment or any of Plato's definitions of this, that, or the other, but rather to seize upon the fact that in dialogue after dialogue, Socrates shows that nothing can be known. After all, that's why Socrates is the wisest of all, is he says he knows nothing. And in dialogue after dialogue, he says, let's consider linguistics. Do words work this way or do they work that way? He proposes both of the major alternatives, shows that neither is satisfactory, and the dialogue concludes without an answer. The skeptical academy concluded from this that the heart of wisdom was never committing to any belief. It was resisting the temptation to adhere to a belief. This is an interesting period of Hellenistic philosophy, but we'll have to leave it to one side because we move now to Middle Platonism. And in this case, we aren't dealing with an ancient designation. When we say Middle Platonism, that's a modern term. And it's a modern term that in some ways just betrays the fact that modern people don't think Middle Platonism is good for much, and therefore middle is sort of this holding over period, keeping supper warm until Plotinus in the fullness of time could arrive and give us Neoplatonism, where things get really heady and really interesting. Now, this is not a fair, in the past 30 or 40 years, there's been a modern revival of interest in Middle Platonism and a recognition that Middle Platonism and Neoplatonism share the same sets of interests and concerns, even if we can perhaps identify some differences. So I'll describe some main trends in this period of Platonism together. And Plotinus and his successors are folks we will have to deal with later on, because these guys were major intellectuals. They were also sometimes classmates of the biggest church fathers. So they studied together, they knew each other's thought, they were learning from each other and reacting to each other. But for now, we will content ourselves with Middle Platonism, and note that from about the time of 80 BC, there is a sense of recovering dogmatic Platonism. And dogmatic doesn't have the negative connotations. It simply means actually asserting teachings, dogmas, doctrines. So we get a shift from the skeptical academy and an insistence, no, we need to assert things. Plato did teach. He had views on epistemology, on ethics, on metaphysics, and we need to decide which of those matters and teach them clearly. There's a trend here, and it's concurrent with the rediscovery of Aristotle's texts beginning in the 1st century BC. They had been lost for some time, they're reintroduced. There's an effort to say Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics, so far from being rival schools, they're all teaching pretty much the same thing. Now, to achieve this, there's a bit of eclecticism, and that's a word you will hear associated with Middle Platonism. Meaning, we will take from Aristotle his logic, and we will take from the Stoics, let's say, their ethics, their insistence on that virtue is the greatest good, and that life should be lived according to nature. We will take from Pythagoras number mysticism, and we'll bring these all together and say, basically, they all agree with Plato. The whole tradition more or less agrees, and let's major on the majors. Another feature of this period of Platonic thought is a marked attention to theology and what we might loosely call mysticism. Now, Plato already talks about God and the gods, so it's not a new thing, but of all the things Plato talks about, his theology is something that Middle Platonism seizes upon as especially worthy of attention and development. So, if we want to tease this out a bit more, because obviously thinking about Middle Platonic theology is going to be interesting for us as we consider someone like Justin Martyr, who says, basically, I can see some convergence between Plato's teaching and ours as Christians. So Middle Platonism, attentive to theology and respectful of religious traditions. Those needn't be the same thing in the ancient world. After all, some of the first philosophical comments we have about religious practices are laughing at the absurdity of religious practices. But in this period, we get several Platonic figures like Plutarch, like Numenius of Apamea, and like the person whom we just devoted a lecture to, Philo of Alexandria, in their own ways, trying to make sense of how concrete religious practices do ultimately agree and cohere and show the truth about God. So Plutarch will analyze Egyptian myth and ritual. He writes a book on Isis and Osiris. And he's trying to make sense of how the strange things that go on in Egypt actually show truths about nature and about God. Plutarch himself is a priest of Apollo. He writes about worship in his own Greek cities. Numenius is writing about various Oriental religions, and one thing he'll notice that they all concur on the incorporeality of God. And of course, Philo, in his own way, fits into this tradition. And although he doesn't present himself this way, he is, in a sense, saying that the truths of another Eastern religion, namely that of the Hebrews, contain all the truths that Plato would later discover. All of these figures will criticize superstition, they'll use that word, desidaimonia, as a deformation of proper religion. So when I say they're respectful to religion, that doesn't mean each and every practice that someone has will they regard as a good thing. They can be quite harsh. But on the whole, they'll say, you know what, there is one sun in the sky, and different peoples have different words for sun in their respective languages. So it is for God. Different words, different practices, but one God. Somewhat related to this trend in Middle Platonic thought is a real interest in Plato's Timaeus. And not only are they curious about the creator figure in the Timaeus, the timing of creation, the materials with which he worked, whether the forms are separate from this creator or in his mind, etc., but they're writing detailed commentaries on the Timaeus and parsing every word. Plato at this point is called the divine Plato, and that's meant sort of half true. His texts become almost sacred, and they can be parsed down to the minutest details in terms of trying to establish right beliefs. If we think about what is put forward in Middle Platonic dogmatic theology in their teaching, a couple trends are clear. Probably the most striking is that God becomes ever more remote or transcendent. We get apophatic or negative theology. This is something Christians will develop extensively later. God can only be defined by what God is not. God is unknowable, unchanging, ineffable. That all sounds good at some level, but it will create, of course, a set of theological problems. How does an increasingly transcendent God relate to this physical world? How can you uphold God's providence, for instance? How do you avoid an Epicurean theology that just imagines that the gods are just hopelessly far away and don't care about anything that's going on? Not only is there a problem of providence, but if God is controlling this world, how can free will be maintained? And whence evil? If there's only a single God, where did evil sneak in? This is a problem that Middle and Neoplatonists will address and that Gnostics will have a particular take on. So I'll talk more about that in another lecture. How can God be known if God is unknowable? Well, they'll have some answers. And in a kernel form, the problem that you'll see Middle Platonists wrestling with and Neoplatonists wrestling with is the one and the many. If everything has its origin in one supremely good and transcendent God, how did we end up with the current universe that we witness, full of diversity, change, flux, and far worse than just change and flux, but frankly, evil, disease, sickness, sadness, and so on? More on that at another occasion. In terms of ethics, we will see again that Middle Platonism is enormously amenable to Christianity. The core of Middle Platonic ethics would be a line from Plato himself, from the Theaetetus, where Socrates says, our goal should be to escape from this realm to the realm of the good as quickly as we can. And he defines escape. Escape doesn't mean leaving political life. It doesn't mean going off in a cell. It means becoming like God so far as is possible. And becoming like God is at its core ethical. It means being just and holy and having wisdom. This is one of the most frequently quoted expressions, and it becomes like the chapter heading to which various subheadings will be added as people try to work out ethics, and in the Neoplatonic period, even things that strike us as quite bizarre, like theurgy, where in order to become a god, you might need to cook up a magical spell and a little incantation. And so there are spells circulating which have the title, How to Become a God. Anyway, leaving aside the stranger permutations of Neoplatonism, we'll stick now with this sort of earnest ethical effort to be just and holy because God is just and holy. Because a Platonic world will have God above and the physical world below, where humans dwell, both the epistemological and the ethical will entail some sort of bridge. In terms of ethics, as we get this summary from what we've read from Alcinous's Handbook of Platonism, he says philosophy is striving for wisdom, namely freeing the soul from the body up toward what is intelligible and what truly is. This isn't the realm of what is, this is the realm of becoming, change. So you can see that the epistemology, the ontology, and the ethics are all intertwined. The realm above is the realm of what truly is. This is the realm of flux and becoming. Therefore, humans must strive to go upward, and that means to some degree subduing the body. The body, soma in Greek, is a grave, sema. So Philo himself quotes this, and he says, Heraclitus learned this from Moses. So Philo of Alexandria thinks this whole idea that the body is a grave is just good biblical ideas. At any rate, the pre-Socratic Heraclitus coins the expression, and it's quoted again and again. You can see the massive common ground. Hellenistic Jew, pre-Socratic, philosophical tradition, all agreeing the goal is to ascend toward true being in mind, and therefore to escape from body. What I want to do at this point is do a bit of simple compare and contrast, showing above all how much common ground there was between Middle Platonism and Justin Martyr's theology. And when we've done that, we'll seize upon one particular issue, that is Justin's treatment of God's Logos, and we'll give it a bit more detailed examination so that we can see both what work the Logos is doing for Justin and his intellectual system, and also some of the problems that Logos theology would encounter in later Trinitarian controversies. So to begin with, common ground, things taken for granted in Middle Platonism that Justin also affirms. We might begin by saying the supreme God created the cosmos out of unformed matter. The surprising part there might be that Justin, like Plato in the Timaeus, affirms that the creation is made from something already existing. So Justin says, in order to show that Plato borrowed from our teacher, that is, the Word speaking through the prophets, when Plato claimed that God made the universe by changing formless matter, here are the words of Moses. He gives a quote from Moses and then concludes, thus you can see that by God's word, the universe was made out of this substratum. This will be important because debates about the creation of the cosmos and its eternity or non-eternity loom large in this period and end up relating to debates about the nature of the sons being begotten but not made and so on, which I'm happy to pass to Alex on a later week. God is transcendent. There's an increasing emphasis throughout this period on the complete transcendence of God, and Justin is no different. He says, God, the Father of all, is unbegotten. He is given no name. Even the appellation God is not a name, but an opinion implanted in the nature of humans, of a thing that can hardly be explained. God can hardly be understood, let alone named. He quotes here, approvingly, Socrates' claim that the Father and Creator of all is not easy to find, nor is it safe for one who has found him to declare him to everyone. That's from Plato's Timaeus. This is, as Chadwick puts it, perhaps the most hackneyed quotation of Plato in the entire Hellenistic period. But Justin affirms it. He says, yes, we're just like Socrates. We're being persecuted and put to death because we're talking about God who is hard to search out and find. Third, intermediary figures are summoned to help bridge the gap between this transcendent God or one and the cosmos, the universe. These would include, above all, Logos, which is the one we're going to explore more fully, but also the planets, which the entire ancient world assumed were divinities of some sort, and daimons, which for Christians quickly become demons, that is, nasty intermediary beings, but Middle Platonism was quite interested in daimons, that's a more neutral being. You may recall that Socrates himself was always warned by a daimon whenever he was going to do something wrong. So if he was going to do something impious or unjust, his little guardian angel, his little daimon would tell him, don't do this, Socrates. Well, there's a past, that's an actual textual tradition in Plato that people wanted to flesh out. What was this daimon of Socrates? But more broadly speaking, there's an interest in the intermediary beings. Logos, as I mentioned, we already saw in Philo's treatment, Logos becomes one way of explaining how a transcendent God can avoid getting his hands dirty with the world of becoming and change. That is, the world is governed by God's reason, God's Logos. And this can be called a second God, as Philo does and as Justin does. We'll tease out Logos a bit more later. Justin does something slightly different from what Middle Platonists would do with demons in particular, because as you will have seen, shot through his writings are references to demons doing nasty things, above all, persecuting the truth, whether it was stirring up opposition to Socrates, or whether it's stirring up opposition to Christianity, whether it's teaching pagans to do fake versions of the true liturgy, which is how Justin explains the mystery religions and why they seem so much alike what Christians do in their congregations. Demons are a useful way for him to explain the nastiness in the world. Moving along, in terms of ethics, it's not only the content of ethics that Christians share largely with Middle Platonism, but a set of tenets, above all, that virtuous behavior follows true knowledge. And relatedly, the insistence that people are free and responsible for their actions. Middle Platonists embraced the older Socratic view that people always do what they know to be good. If you think about this, that's a little surprising. Often when you say, I know I shouldn't eat the donut, but I eat the donut, I'd say I did what I knew to be wrong. And of course, the Apostle Paul in Romans 7 insists precisely that that's what happens. You see the good and you approve, but you do the worse. Well, Justin, you'll note Justin never quotes the Apostle Paul, never names the Apostle Paul. He does not take that attitude. He takes the Socratic view, which was popular in Middle Platonism, that if you know the truth, you do it. It's that simple. And therefore any bad behavior, any sin, is simply a product of ignorance, of wrong belief. So Justin partially uses this to defend Christians against this sort of extravagant charges that they're involved in Thyestean feasts and so on and so forth. He says, look, if everyone knew that salvation is dependent upon virtue, nobody would have chosen vice even for a moment. Every person would follow this self-restrained and orderly path of virtue. If they knew salvation was in the balance, they would all do what was right. And he says, we do know salvation's in the balance because God's going to judge us according to our deeds. So of course we're not involved in these terrible crimes we're accused of. Justin doesn't show any awareness of like the Pauline notion of the flesh, that there's some force that either in the world or in the human makeup that prevents people from doing what they know to be good. Justin is like Middle Platonism, and this is a divergence from Stoicism in insisting that people are also free. And I won't belabor that too much, but you can see that if you want to insist on a strong form of providence, it can be hard to carve out human freedom and human culpability. Middle Platonists did this by saying that perhaps providence just established the rules of this cosmos, the rules of cause and effect, but then we are free, sort of as it were, to play around and reap the rewards or the consequences of our own actions. Fifth, Justin insists that all truth is God's truth, and this is very much a Middle Platonic interest. This goes back to the Middle Platonists, assuming that particular myths or oracles or religious traditions will in some way be gesturing toward the truth that both Aristotle and Plato, that also the Stoics, that also the Pythagoreans, together share a large common core of the truth. And for Justin, where he is different from other Christians of the 2nd century, is he will insist that it's not only Christians and the biblical tradition that have the truth, because God's light shines in all people to some degree. We'll flesh this out a bit more as we look at his teaching on the Logos. So, we make a transition here, and we're going to tease out a bit more the nature of God's intermediary, the Logos, in Justin, and what work this does for him, how he develops it. To begin with, we'll note a Stoic idea. For Stoics, you needn't concern yourselves really with the heritage of this, because they cede this to common belief by the 1st century. For Stoics, the universe is given shape and structure by pneuma, which is spirit or breath or wind. It's the normal word translated spirit, which is also called logos, rationality, reason. Pneuma and logos can be said to be God. Stoics are pantheists, so everything is God, but God is the pneumatic force. God is the pneumatic force that gives rational shape to all passive matter. So pneuma pervades the universe, which means that logos pervades the universe. It's a constructive energy or fire. If you want a modern analogy, you could go to the Star Wars saga and think about the Force.
The Force? Now, the Force is what gives the Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us and penetrates us. It binds the galaxy together.
Having taken one page from the Stoics, we can take yet another. That is, the Logos, which primarily means rationality, reason, can also mean spoken utterance, speech, language. In the Gospel of John, you are accustomed to seeing Logos translated as word, which is something Logos can mean. The Stoic linguists developed a distinction between Logos and diathetos, that is, word as thought, and Logos prophorikos, word put forward, word as speech. You'll see why this is important in a moment. So, reason and logos can mean my thought of a horse. I haven't said anything, there's just an idea. Logos prophorikos is an utterance, me saying, horse. These are two moments of logos. When you say logos, when you say horse, there's something physical. There's concussive waves of sound. The thought is not physical. This idea offers a way for Justin and other Christians to make sense of how there could be a thought always with God that at one point in time was instantiated in history, because that's a challenge. So imagine with God. God thinks light. God's spoken word is let there be light. And with God, unlike with us, when he says something, something happens. To take the more pertinent example for logos, the logos that is always with God, God's own rationality or Sophia or wisdom, is the Son. That is logos and diathetos, the Son that's always with God. When you speak something, you don't lose that thing. So there's no change in God when the Son comes forth into history. It is simply like a spoken word. Christ incarnate, Christ in Judea in the year 30 is like the spoken word. So this provides a model, this idea of logos and diathetos, logos prophorikos, provides a model for thinking about how the word could always be with God and yet could have entered history at a point in time. There's a further implication for Justin, and that is that because God is utterly transcendent, God can't make an appearance on the human scene. It's only God's logos. So for Justin, it is the logos that speaks through the prophets in the Old Testament. It is the logos that makes an appearance in the form of theophanies. But at this point, Justin is able to ask, what else was God's logos doing before becoming incarnate in Christ? Justin will say, God's logos was also available to anyone who was speaking truth. All humans partake of logos. That's what makes us humans and not animals. And Socrates, for instance, when he spoke an enormous amount of truth, was just especially endowed with the logos that would one day be incarnate in Jesus Christ. In fact, Justin is so bold as to say, we're basically like Socrates. He was put to death for proclaiming the truth about God. So are we. Justin, of course, handles the truth that's outside the Hebrew tradition in two ways. On the one hand, he'll say that Moses sometimes was just poaching ideas from, Plato was poaching ideas from Moses because he read Moses. So I've put Socrates a wee bit lower on the ladder here. Plato and Socrates may have read the prophets, may have read the law, but also they were just endowed with God's spermatikos logos, and that's what enabled them to speak the truth. That means that Justin can quite boldly say that, and I quote here from Apology 2, anything good that has ever been said belongs to us Christians. We worship and love the Logos, who is from the unbegotten and inexpressible God, and he became a human being for our sakes. Everything up to the part about becoming a human being, most other Middle Platonists could have agreed. So, at any rate, we see how Justin is able to make sense of the fact that there's an awful lot of good and truth outside the Old Testament and the Christian tradition. He's also able to address a theological problem of how an immutable, ineffable God can remain transcendent and yet interact with this world. The Logos and the idea of Logos that had been developed in Middle Platonic and even Stoic philosophy gave him a tool for this idea. What we want to ask, taking a view toward future developments of Christology and Trinitarian thought, is for Justin, okay, Justin, we can see the work Logos is doing for you. Some of it's similar to other Middle Platonism, some of it's different. But is this Logos you describe also God? Well, Justin gives a variety of statements, and it's clear that this is not something he's carefully theorized, because his statements are a little bit all over the place. He says, on the one hand, Logos is worshipped as God and Christ. It's a little confusing because it's both God and Christ, but okay, it's worshipped. He says Logos is subordinated to God the Father, the transcendent God. Subordinationism may not be such a divergence from things we saw Paul say in 1 Corinthians 15. He says Logos is numerically distinct. Now it's sounding rather different and less like simply God's wisdom than as something distinct from God, which calls into question, is it really God? Whom we worship in second place to God. That will be troubling at a later point in time. And finally, to give an example of a statement that's just all over the place, I'll read you a paragraph from the Dialogue with Trypho, chapter 61. Justin says, in the scriptures we see that God begat a beginning before creation. He seems to use the word beginning there as a thing. And the beginning was a certain rational power, that is a logikos power. It's also called the glory of God, this beginning, this power that was begotten, It's also called the Son. It's called wisdom. It's called an angel. Ouch, that sounds quite distinct from God. It's also called God, and it's called Lord and Logos. And on other occasions, he goes on and on. This is something to just tuck away and realize that Logos theology will struggle to explain exactly how the Logos is a separate person and is fully God. But that can be a chapter for another day. In the meantime, I hope you'll join me in appreciating Justin's accomplishment of seeing a significant common ground between the Christian proclamation and Middle Platonic thought, and also developing in creative ways a Christian adaptation of philosophical developments and putting them to practical use in the defense of Christians, who, after all, he's not doing this, he's not debating this in an armchair. He is noting the similarities of Christianity with Greek philosophy and with some Greek religion for the life and death matter of explaining why Christians, although they may be proclaiming something somewhat different about God, aren't doing anything illegal or untoward. In the end, they're not doing something so different from Socrates.